All right, so in this talk, I'm going to be talking about how to biblically deal with false accusation and mistreatment. Say, I don't see a lot of folks, ministers, authors, etc., talking about this. At least not in this like specific way, but has become a pretty big issue these days. There's a lot of mistreatment. It's more frequently not physical mistreatment. There is a lot of coldness, a lot of underhanded, petty, but yet painful, harmful treatment of people. And so I think it's something important for every believer to have some kind of biblical framework. So let me take a look at some different areas of how to address this issue. And the first section that I want to deal with is the foundation of how to deal with this, which starts with a trust in God through any sort of mistreatment rather than being guided or trapped by fear. Proverbs 29 verse 25 says, "Fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe." Now, the Hebrew word for snare refers to a hunter's trap. It's a device designed to capture and immobilize its prey. And when we fear man, we become trapped in an endless cycle of image management and reputation defense. The pressure to control in an endless cycle, the pressure to control how others perceive you, to clear your name through constant explanation and self-justification. Now this creates a spiritual and emotional prison. And when that happens, we become enslaved to the opinions of others. We monitor their words. We monitor their actions. We constantly assess whether or not we have successfully convinced them of our innocence, or that we are acceptable, or that we are worthy of their attention or their friendship or their love. However, biblical endurance begins with a mental shift or a different approach to this, and it requires a releasing of the need to control how others perceive us, and instead placing our confidence in God's ultimate judgment and vindication. Now, of course, this does not mean passivity or indifference to our reputation. Scripture speaks often of the value of a good name. So it is not only acceptable but good to desire and seek a good name, a good reputation. That is different than living in fear of the opinions of others. What it means is the proper way of viewing or being concerned about our reputation means recognizing that our ultimate reputation rests with God and not with those who either falsely accuse us or falsely view us, and cannot be persuaded no matter what we say or even sometimes do. So in those situations, it is very important that we trust the Lord to be our defender. And when we do that, we are kept safe, and not necessarily from slander or being falsely spoken of or mistreated, but from the internal spiritual destruction that comes from living in fear of that mistreatment or that false accusation. And something else that's important to recognize is that when we live in this kind of fear, we are actually disrespecting ourselves. And you cannot build respect not only for yourself but from other people when we beg and we plead for the approval of other people. What happens when we do this? It invites disrespect, not only from others, but we are disrespecting ourselves. When there is desperation to control others' opinions of you, this communicates weakness, not strength. And as a result of that, it invites further disrespect rather than establishing our dignity and self-respect. Oh, it's a very important biblical principle to understand. All right, let's look at another related verse. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 to 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." So when we are falsely accused or mistreated, oftentimes the circumstances of these situations become complex and even bewildering. This is partly because we can't see the full picture. We can't see all that's going on behind the scenes. We don't know what everyone has said or done. And on top of that, we don't understand why God allows this sort of thing to happen to us, because it's not fair. We don't understand why this injustice is allowed to happen. The other thing we often do in this kind of situation is we ruminate or replay conversations. We constantly analyze past relationships, current relationships. We try to figure out how maybe a false narrative was started about us. We're trying to figure out what went wrong, what we could have done differently, what we could have said differently to avoid getting in that situation. So there's all of these thoughts and rumination that can take place in the situation. Our minds may race to try to figure out explanations, to formulate defenses. And while it is important to think on these things and to learn from them, that's not what Scripture tells us to do. It is good to learn, but what is not good is to overthink, to overanalyze, to live in this perpetual fear, which is not productive. The call of Scripture in this situation is not to figure out through our human reasoning, because many times these situations cannot be understood with reasoning or 100% rational thought, because most of these situations aren't rational. They're not reasonable. Because they are founded on often lies or just complete misunderstanding, malicious behavior from others that just doesn't make any sense. So in the situation, the biblical call or the biblical instruction in these situations is to trust that God is ordering these events and is aware of these events. He's in control of these events, and behind the scenes, somehow, some way, that these things are happening for our good at the time, even though we can't perceive what that good or what the ultimate ending is going to be, and it often feels like there will never be an ending, or a relief. The call is to trust in the Lord with all of our heart, and not to lean on our own understanding. And in these kinds of situations, it is often the hardest to follow this verse. It's very easy to say, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding when things are going well. But when we are stuck in this kind of trap, that's when it's really tested. Are we really trusting the Lord with all our heart and not leaning on our own understanding? Now, just to look at this a little more closely, the phrase lean not on your own understanding, it doesn't discourage wisdom or discernment. What it's warning against is relying exclusively on our limited perspective when we are navigating or trying to figure out injustice or unfairness that's happening to us in the context of mistreatment. So our understanding, our minds see the accusation. It sees the unfairness, the mistreatment. It sees the damage to our reputation, and maybe in some cases relationships that have been poisoned or maliciously influenced against us. What we have to keep in perspective is that God understands. He sees all of this happening from the end, from the beginning to the end. And he knows and has a plan for how he will use this evil for our refinement and for his glory. This is where our trust really comes in these kinds of situations. And so where it says to submit to him in all of our ways means to surrender our timeline for when things will be made right, when we will be vindicated, which sometimes our timeline is much, much shorter than God's. In the case of Joseph, God's timeline was 17 years until he was fully vindicated. So we have to recognize that God's timeline for resolving or vindicating us in these situations are often, if not usually, much different than ours. So it's important not to expect God to follow our preferred methods or to demand that justice take place on our schedule, because that's the opposite of trusting, right? Part of trusting God is trusting his timing. We have to truly trust God, we have to trust his timing, which is often, if not usually, much longer than ours. And when we do this, he promises to make our paths straight. Not immediately, but eventually he will do it. And it will be ordered towards his purpose and towards our good. All right, now let's talk about boundaries. Let's talk about what the Bible says about boundaries, which are also very important in these situations, and just in life in general. It's very important to not only know about boundaries, it's important to know that not only are they okay to have boundaries, but it's very important that we do. It's wise to set boundaries. Proverbs 25 and verse 28 says, like a city whose walls are broken, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. In the ancient world, a city's walls were its primary defense against invasion, plunder, and destruction. A city with broken walls was very vulnerable to every enemy that came to it. The inhabitants of this kind of city lived in constant danger. They couldn't sleep soundly. They couldn't live their lives normally from day to day. They had no security. Solomon here is using this image of a city without walls to describe a person who lacks self-control, which is a type of a boundary. And someone who has no boundary, does not have the boundary of self-control, does not have protective barriers against external assaults. If you lack self-control, you don't have the discipline to protect yourself, not only against careless words and actions that will invite harm towards you, but you also won't have the control to know how to defend yourself against malicious behavior from other people as well. Now, self-control is not a weakness, but it is the boundary that protects our stability, our peace, and our dignity. And without self-control, accusations greatly impact and erode our emotional stability. False narratives easily invade our thinking, and chaos becomes a prominent place mentally in our minds, because we don't have the internal control, the internal discipline to control the onslaught of internal thoughts, negative thoughts, harmful thoughts that will take place in this particular situation. Also, self-control means knowing when to speak, but also when to remain silent. And it means refusing to be provoked into reckless responses that only give ammunition to our accusers. It also means protecting our hearts and minds from the constant barrage of unjust criticism by setting limits on how much access we give to those who harm us. Because if we permit others to trample our dignity without consequences, we are allowing disrespect. We are disrespecting ourselves, and we are allowing others to disrespect us. Now, these boundaries are not merely about controlling others, or not really controlling others, but it's not about preventing others from harming us. It's about honoring ourselves as made in the image of God. When we fail to protect ourselves from harm through these wise boundaries, we are communicating with people that are harming us that their mistreatment of us is acceptable, that we will allow it to happen. And the types of people that inflict abuse and mistreatment take this as a sign that it's okay to continue doing this, because they themselves don't have the self-control or the discipline or understanding that their behavior is not okay. And when we allow it to continue to happen, it is giving them permission to continue to harm us. And so it's not only okay to protect ourselves from mistreatment, but it is biblically wise to do it. It's imperative to do it. We have to set boundaries with other people, with harmful people. Otherwise, it very often, if not the majority of the time, invites them to continue to do it. Let's look at another verse, another related verse. Proverbs 22, verse 3 says, "The prudent see danger, and they take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty." Wisdom means recognizing patterns of mistreatment and taking protective action rather than continuing to expose ourselves to ongoing damage or manipulation. This isn't paranoia or bitterness. It's actually a form of discernment. According to this verse, the prudent person observes this kind of harmful behavior over time. It identifies destructive patterns, and it responds to this harmful behavior by creating a distance with these people and establishing clear boundaries with people that cause them harm and mistreatment. And so, in contrast, a simple person who ignores this warning, ignores the warning signs, rationalizes the harmful behavior, makes excuses for the abuser and their abuse, and continues in the relationship without setting boundaries, acting as if nothing is wrong, what's going to be the result of that? Just as this Proverbs verse says, they are going to pay the penalty. The simple keep going and they pay the penalty. But the prudent see danger and they take refuge. So we have a choice. If we are being mistreated or abused or falsely accused, we can either continue going as if nothing is wrong, pay the penalty, continue to endure repeated harm, or we can be like the prudent person, see the danger and take refuge. Now, the taking refuge does not always mean physical separation, although in certain cases, obviously, physical abuse, for example, would definitely necessitate physical separation. But it can also mean it also applies to any other kind of abuse, whether it can be verbal abuse or psychological abuse. It can mean refusing to engage in circular arguments that lead nowhere, to refusing to engage in harmful discussion and malicious or hateful verbal conversation's not the right word. It's not really a conversation, but harmful verbal abuse. It can also mean limiting the information that we share, because certain people will use that information against us. Even if we're sharing out of a pure heart or a genuine heart, some people prey upon others. They are predatory. They take that information, they use it against us. And so we have to be careful about the information. We have to be discreet and careful with who we share our deepest thoughts and information. All right. It can also mean declining invitations, or not associating in certain situations where we know that this type of harm or mistreatment or maybe false accusations may take place. If we think that there's going to be that this kind of behavior is going to take place, we don't want to be in that context. We don't intentionally insert ourselves into that context where that may happen. On the more positive side, it can mean that we surround ourselves instead with people who know our character and they can speak truth when the lies become overwhelming, or maybe we just need general support, which is also very important. That's part of taking refuge, is finding those that can support us. If we are in the middle of this sort of situation, it's very important that we have others to support us through that. It's important to have that support even if we're not, right? So the principle here is that biblical love does not require us to remain in the line of fire. It doesn't require us to intentionally stay in these situations. If we can get out of these situations, we need to do so. It is prudent to do it. If we don't, we will pay the penalty. And so this kind of prudence protects us so that we can endure a season of mistreatment long term without more harm than may happen otherwise. All right, now let's talk about when to speak and when to remain silent. When to speak and when to remain silent. Proverbs 10 verses 19 says, "Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues." Now, false accusations, when we're falsely accused, what is one of the first things we want to do? Oftentimes, it is to defend ourselves. Sometimes the overwhelming pressure to say, no, that's not true. And that's not necessarily wrong to do, but sometimes it is. Oftentimes, in these situations, our whole heart wants to respond, to correct the record, to make sure that everyone hears our side of the story and that we're heard. And sometimes that is appropriate. However, Scripture teaches that endless self-defense, or a multiplying of words, often validates the false narrative by giving it attention. When we respond to every accusation, when we're constantly defending ourselves and using more and more words, we are signaling that these false accusations have power over us. Well, he keeps talking about it, so maybe it's true. Why is he so defensive? Maybe it's true. We become, and instead of being steady and stable because we're confident that these accusations are false, or that it's a matter of mistreatment, and that we are actually innocent, or that we did something that we shouldn't have done, but we have changed, and yet despite that we are no one believes that. If we are reactive to these kinds of accusations rather than steady, it does not communicate what we think it does. It does not communicate our innocence. It actually often does the opposite. It causes us to appear desperate rather than confident, which is what we need to do, which is why this Proverbs verse says that the prudent hold their tongues. Right? We can't defeat these accusations or mistreatment by constantly talking about it, right? Even though it feels like that's the right way, Solomon says that sin isn't ended by multiplying words, but instead it's by holding our tongue. Now, the phrase sin is not ended by multiplying words suggests that the more we talk in our own defense, the greater likelihood is what? That we will say something foolish. The more we talk, the more we defend ourselves, the more words we use, the more likely it is that we're going to say something that can be twisted, something that accidentally gives credibility to the accusation, right? The prudent person, the wise person, recognizes that silence and example are often far stronger and more effective responses than words. And this is why you see Jesus very frequently not saying anything when he's in certain situations. Because our life lived with integrity over time speaks far more powerfully than any verbal defense that we can construct. If our actual actions and our integrity simply prove accusations to be false, then those lies and mistruths will simply die. They'll simply die because they have nowhere to go. They have nothing to stick to. Now, often that situation may take time to eventually develop, and the Bible talks about this, but it will happen. So, but oftentimes we make it worse by using words. Don't underestimate the power of silence, the power of example in these situations. Now, if you must speak, the way we speak is critical. It is important to speak with warmth and to speak with confidence. This is extremely important. When we speak in these situations, it should communicate, I believe in me. I am not afraid. I am not worried about the outcome. I know that I am innocent, or I know the situation, I know the circumstances, and I know that God is with me. And of course, this principle applies to false accusations, especially when we appear calm and unbothered, and when we refuse to plead and to over-explain. What does it communicate? it communicates strength. It communicates innocence, right? And it's not dishonest because you really are innocent. You really the mistreatment or the false accusations really truly have no power. And what happens in this scenario is that those that are accusing us, they are expecting us as people who are guilty in their eyes or worthy of their condemnation. They expect us to collapse, to beg, to be desperate, right? To win their approval. That is not what you want to do, right? What happens is as we remain steady, as we remain confident in this situation, it powerfully destabilizes the false narrative, and mistreatment as well. Very important. I will answer questions. We'll do like a question and answer thing. If, we should have time. So Connor, I will get to that once we get done with this. So I'm not ignoring you. All right, let's look at another verse here. I think I need to move a little bit more quickly here. Proverbs 26 verses 4-5 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." Now, first glance, this passage appears to be contradictory on the surface, but in reality, it contains a very significant wisdom about discernment. Because there are times when engaging a false accusation is necessary, but there are other times when engaging actually only entangles us further with futile arguments and debate. Verse 4 warns us that if we respond to foolishness in the same manner as the fool, with anger or insults or emotional reactivity, we become like him. We become indistinguishable from the foolish person. And in doing so, we come down to his level. And what does that do? It doesn't communicate our innocence. It doesn't communicate confidence, and we lose the moral authority, so to speak. Verse 5, however, acknowledges that sometimes we need to answer a foolish person because it means that his foolishness must be exposed so that he does not believe himself to be wise. If a false accusation is left entirely unchallenged, in some cases, the accuser may assume his lies are accepted as truth. And in such cases, a measured, factual response may be necessary, not to convince the accuser, but to provide clarity to those outside of that conversation who are observing the situation. Now, it can be difficult to determine which situation is which. And this is where we have to pray for wisdom to know which approach is the most appropriate in each circumstance. And it requires prayerful discernment and very often counsel of trusted advisors. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about how truth is demonstrated through action. Truth demonstrated through action. Proverbs 18:17 says, "In a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right until someone comes forward and cross-examines." Now, false accusations often gain traction because they are presented first with passion and conviction. The first narrative, especially if delivered by someone who appears wounded or victimized, can seem very credible. And people naturally sympathize with the one who speaks first. They become a part of the story even. It resonates with them. They accept it as truth. And they form opinions before hearing alternative perspectives. However, Scripture teaches that the first account is not the final account. The initial narrative, no matter how convincing, must be cross-examined. And over time, as we mentioned earlier, our consistent character and behavior will serve as that cross-examination. If the accusation is false, inconsistencies will arise. And those who know you will observe the disconnect between the accusation and the person they have witnessed over months and years. And so truth, lived out with integrity, will eventually expose lies or exaggerated claims, etc., etc. Now, this is another reason why our response to false accusations is so critical. Because if instead we respond with bitterness or rage or vengefulness, we can inadvertently lend credibility to the accusation. But if we respond with steadiness, with grace, and we maintain our integrity, even when we are unjustly attacked or mistreated or abused, the falseness of the accusation will become apparent eventually. So another important point. Proverbs 12 verse 19 says, "Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment." Though lies may spread rapidly and damage reputation temporarily, truth embodied in your life will outlast deception. Lies are inherently unstable. This is very important to recognize. Lies are unstable. They require constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, constant adjustment as contradiction emerges. Truth, on the other hand, does not require maintenance. It simply is. And over time, the instability of lies collapses under its own weight while the truth endures. Now, this, of course, is not to say that our vindication comes quickly or painlessly. The moment referred to in this proverb is not necessarily limited to a literal moment. Sometimes those moments can be years. But compared to the eternal endurance of truth, it is a brief span. However, in some cases, we may have to endure for months or even years, just as Joseph did in his situation. However, if we live faithfully and trust God in these things, the truth will prevail. Lies and dishonesty will not. All right. Let's move on to the next section. Let's talk about enduring injustice with integrity. Enduring injustice with integrity. Proverbs 24:10 says, "If you falter in a time of trouble, how small is your strength?" Now, this verse serves as both a warning and an encouragement. It warns that the true measure of our strength is not found in comfortable circumstances, but in how we respond when trouble comes. Because it's easy to appear strong when life is easy. But adversity reveals the depth or the shallowness of our character. If we falter, if we fail, if we stumble, if we compromise our convictions, or if we abandon our integrity when the pressure is hard, it reveals that our strength is small, that our strength is not substantial. So, at the same time, this verse encourages our endurance, perseverance through an unjust season, through mistreatment, through false accusations, reveals actual strength. The temptation during these seasons of false accusation and mistreatment is to give up, to compromise our convictions in order to make the pain stop, or to retaliate in kind. However, endurance, remaining faithful to God's work, to God's way, even when it costs us, is proof of our strength. It is proof of our resting in God and trusting in God. Now, this charge is not a condemnation. It is a call to rise up in the moment. It's a call to recognize that during this time, it's an opportunity for God to refine us, to make us stronger, to bring us to a new level of strength and maturity that we didn't think was possible before. So it's important to recognize this and to allow this fiery trial that we may be going through to purify us, to strengthen us, and not to collapse and give up during this time. Because if we endure through it, the effect that it will have on us will be to mature us and bring us to a place of strength that we never thought possible. We will become someone who we never thought we could become as we endure. So this is very important to understand and to apply, of course. All right, Proverbs 16 verse 7 says, "When the Lord takes pleasure in anyone's way, he causes their enemies to make peace with them." Now, even though our vindication may come more slowly, or even much more slowly than we think it should, or more than we want it to, our faithfulness during this time does not go unnoticed by God. When our ways please the Lord, when we maintain integrity during false accusation, during mistreatment or abuse, when we refuse to retaliate, when we trust Him rather than try to manipulate circumstances or control people, etc., He promises to work in our favor. It doesn't always mean that our enemies or our adversaries are going to, verbally apologize or publicly retract their accusations. But it does mean that God has power to change hearts, to soften those that are against us, or just to change the circumstances, to bring us out of those situations, right? Whatever God does, it is about trusting in His timing by maintaining integrity and by doing what is right. Now, the phrase "causes their enemies to make peace" does not imply passivity on our part, because we're still called to live righteously, to set boundaries, and to pursue reconciliation where appropriate. We have to trust that the ultimate outcome in these situations is that it rests with God, right? But God promises that when He is pleased with our conduct, He intervenes in ways that we cannot orchestrate on our own. So it's very important to trust in God through these times. All right, Matthew 5:16 says, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So our consistent, kind, and boundaried behavior demonstrates the gospel more powerfully than any defense of our reputation. When others observe that we respond to false accusations with grace rather than vengeance, with integrity rather than compromise, they see something special, something otherworldly. They see Christ in us. And whether they acknowledge it immediately or not, that kind of testimony will plant seeds, not just with our adversaries, but with those who are observing the situation. All right. So the goal in these situations is not only to clear our names, it is also to glorify God through how we are enduring that season. When we maintain our witness, even under unjust attacks or mistreatment or abuse, we reflect the character of Christ. What does 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23 say? It says, "When they hurled their insults at Him, He did not retaliate. When He suffered, He made no threats. Instead, He entrusted Himself to Him who judges justly." Even Christ, the Son of God, did not retaliate. He entrusted Himself to God who judges justly, and that is key. Christ has set the example to how we respond to these situations of mistreatment false accusation, abuse, etc. And lastly, the main verse I want you to think about in this is Galatians 6, verse 9, which says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Now, it's important to recognize that as we work on responding correctly to these difficult situations of false accusation or mistreatment or abuse, we're not going to always do it perfectly. We're going to have setbacks, and it's going to be a continuous learning process. But Galatians 6:9 says that if we persist in doing good, with the implication that, yes, we're not always going to be perfect in doing this, but if we persist, continue to strive to do this, at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. It's so important. It's so important to trust God in these situations so that we don't give up. Because many, many times in these very difficult situations, it feels like the right thing to do is to give up. It feels like the right thing to do is to walk away, or to do something that we can't take back, or to do something regretful or harmful back, to retaliate. It feels like that's the right thing to do, but it's not. The right thing to do is not to grow weary in doing good. And God promises that if we do that, we will reap a harvest, and we have to hang on in those incredibly difficult situations. But the fact is this kind of endurance is costly. It is costly. I don't mean to minimize that, because this kind of endurance through these incredibly difficult situations it costs a lot. And there are many days in these situations when we're tempted to give up, to stop doing good, because it seems like it's going nowhere. It seems like it's not actually accomplishing anything. It seems like if it's false accusations, it seems like they're never going to stop. It seems like the relationships are always going to be broken. And it seems like vindication is never going to come. And it's in those times when we need to remember what God tells us, that we are not to become weary in doing good, because God promises at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Remember that God's timing is not our timing, but His timing is perfect. If we do not give up, if we continue to walk in integrity, if we continue to set wise boundaries, if we continue to trust Him with our reputation, with all of the things that need to be reconciled and made right, we will eventually reap a harvest. And that harvest may come in this life, or it may come in the next one. But either way, it will happen. Now, another thing to remember is our faithfulness in the midst of these difficult situations is never wasted. Every moment of patient endurance, every time we choose to respond with grace rather than bitterness, every time we act out of trust when fear seems more natural and reasonable, it's all building something eternal and lasting. This is the posture and the mindset of true faith. And we have to remember that we're not facing these situations alone, that God is always with us. Even though He may seem distant or that He's not listening, He is always with us, and we have to trust in that. All right, that's the end of this talk. Let's see. If anyone has any questions, you can either let me answer Connor's question first, and then we can open it up to others if they have anything. Let's see. I thought I saw a question here earlier. Okay. Does anyone else have any related questions that they would like to ask? Okay. Is it okay to go to others outside the situation? Yes, absolutely. Um, the caveat of that is you have to choose. You have to be careful with who you choose. Um, for example, um, is it gossip? Not necessarily. Oftentimes, let's say you have a difficult situation in the family, a difficult family situation. Ideally, let me give you the ideal setup for this. Ideally, you will have if you have a healthy biblical church with healthy leaders, healthy pastors, you can absolutely go to your pastor. You can absolutely go to your elders. Um, they will have the wisdom and the discernment to handle things discreetly, to not promote gossip, but they will treat the matter appropriately, discreetly. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of people are in situations where they don't have pastors who are qualified. They don't have the maturity. They don't have the experience. They're not really qualified to handle very complicated matters of these, mistreatment or abuse or false accusation, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes they, especially like if it involves other church leaders, if there's like nepotism or conflicts of interest, those are things that have to be considered as well. But the general answer to your question is no. It is okay to go to others. In fact, we must go to others for help and support. A lot of times in these situations the other people can't necessarily help us like to get out of the situation, but they can counsel us or give us advice on what to do or just to encourage us, that sort of thing. There's a lot of situations where a third party, like a counselor or somebody who is totally outside the situation, has no connection, no relational connection whatsoever, that can be a sensible way to get advice or counseling in a certain situation. I'll tell you what's not often a good thing. Let's say you have like an issue in the family. Going to another family member is often a bad idea, because there's often conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, family members are often not neutral, and they don't necessarily even know that. They don't realize that they're not neutral, but they're often not neutral. They can't see the problem objectively. They only see it in the context of their ongoing relationships with other family members. And so that often can make things worse, because then that family member will gossip to other family members, and it just blows it up. So I hope that answers your question somewhat. The answer is yes, it's okay, but you have to think very carefully about who you're going to and the potential fallout of who you're going to. So, like, if you give me a specific situation, then I could maybe expand on it. But that's what I would say is kind of the universal way that I would say it should be approached. All right. Does anybody else have any questions or comments or thoughts? Yes, good verse. Yeah, unfortunately, these kinds of situations are actually very common. They shouldn't be, but they are. There are many spiritual leaders who really shouldn't be leaders. They're not ready. They're not emotionally mature enough to handle things, and so they end up getting actually causing harm to those that they are trying to help. Um, and unfortunately, a lot of people that suffer harm and abuse um, do this silently. They do this in private. They don't have anywhere to go. They don't know how to deal with it. They just kind of quietly live with that harm and abuse. Um, so it's important to talk about it and to see what the Bible actually says. Because I think that something that I have learned, um, I used to think that, when we're suffering, when we're going through something that, we just have to bear it. There's nothing we can do. We just have to wait on God. And yes, that is partly true. But there's also things that we can do, things that we can actively do, like set boundaries. There's certain, like utilizing silence, separating ourselves from those situations that we not only can do but should do. That isn't necessarily that I don't hear about a lot. You often hear about, well, you just need to endure, and that's true, but it's more than that. There are specific biblical ways to endure those situations. It's not just about going through that situation. There are usually things that we can do to take action to at least minimize the harm. Does anyone else have any thoughts or comments or questions? All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, but I'm going to stay on here for a few more minutes just in case. But I'll go ahead and thank everyone that's here, and like I said, I will have a recording of this for anyone who wants to listen. So thanks again for listening.